So yeah, I guess we'll go into then, like I was kind of mentioning, is today we'll kind of talk about like handling like, large data sets within GitHub, that kind of repo and stuff like that, like what that looks like. I kind of showed you guys, I think last week, I showed it like to you guys really quickly, just to kind of show you guys what you can do. So I'm kind of going through that a little bit more detail. And then I think the idea is like maybe next time we can talk a little bit about like baseline models, like what happens when we iterate. And like I say baseline models, but the main thing is like how you iterate on a model. Like what does that look like? And I know Sheena a little bit of that, but maybe we can go a little more detail and you guys can ask direct questions like, well, what would you do next? Or how would we know what to do? So we'll say that for next time, but let's talk about GitHub stuff. So first thing I'm gonna do is just gonna create a new repo just because, why not? Oh yeah, this is a cool trick if you guys didn't know. If you go repo.new, it's actually owned by GitHub. It actually creates a new repo, which is pretty convenient. Actually the same thing with docs, if you guys ever wonder, like doc.new. It's not really related to what we're talking about, but like I just find these super useful. Anyway, so make a new repo here. I'll just call it like test.
Can I ask a GitHub question?
Yeah, go ahead.
This is kind of embarrassing, but so for all of the labs, like I always forked the repos, and I did see how you said to clone them, but I felt like, sometimes I looked at the solutions and like, I don't know, I was just like, okay, I'm just gonna fork them. But I never, when it came to the labs, I never like staged the commits and pushed them. So basically throughout my, like where it displays my activity, for every forked repo, I have like one commit. Yeah, that. And so it's only really when I have projects that mine gets like pretty high. Can I at this point, like if I go back and like every day kind of like commit and push like through each lab, will that show up on my activity or like how does that work?
So you're saying like going forward, if you do git add, git commit, like would that show up? Is that what you're asking, Jessica?
I mean,
or more like
all of my past labs, because like I have so many repos now and I do have all my projects pinned, so that's nice. Like I can see why you told us at the beginning to like do it a certain way. Now that I'm further along, should have listened. But so now I have all these repos, but then if I click on them from my GitHub, it just looks like the original lab because I never, committed and pushed. Yeah.
Yeah. So so your question is like if you do a git add now, like you have those repos already on your computer, right? Your local computer. And you're saying, oh, if you do a git add, git commit, git push, right? Would they show up here?
Yeah.
Is that what you're asking? Answer is, if you forked them, the answer is no. They won't show up. So that's kind of like, that's kind of like what I alluded to, like way back, right? Like, months ago. And totally understandable. And like, that's kind of, I said, like, one thing is you'll have like 500 plus repos, right? From like all the forks and stuff. And I'm like, okay, that's one issue, right? But like, let's pretend we ignore that first. When you fork something, so, okay, you get contributions from a few ways. One is if you make a new repo, which includes a fork, right? So that's why you see like probably on your Git contributions, you see a bunch of like green dots, but you'll say like create a new repository or something like that. Like that's kind of like what shows up. The other way to do it, besides creating a new repo, one is a fork, one's creating a new repo like I'm about to do. The other one is doing commits, right? So you commit something, but those commits on contributions at least only count if they're made to your own repo that is not a fork. So I shouldn't say it's your own repo, but like they're made onto a non-forked repo, which again, forking is confusing a little bit. At least it took me a long time to figure out what forking is because it's a very specific GitHub thing. It's not a Git thing, but you can kind of think of it. I hope I don't confuse you when I say this, but like you can kind of think of a fork as being a branch, like equivalent to a branch, but like for the whole repo, which it sounds like that. I don't know if that makes any sense to people, but yeah.
Go ahead, I'm listening.
Sorry, I see Gina, you unmuted yourself. Did you want to add into that?
Yeah, I didn't have the benefit of way back in the day when I first started at Flatiron and nobody told us what you're telling me now. And not only that, but it was, the explicit instructions were fork the repo, and then write, do your lab and then push it back out. So I guess what that's doing is pushing it back out to that fork. But you're saying it doesn't show up that you've committed anything if you do that.
And the reason why is because when you make a fork, you're basically saying, like what GitHub says when you make a fork is basically, oh, here's this project, here's this repo. And you make a fork, you're basically saying, oh, I'm making the same copy of this repo, but changing something about it. And then the idea there is that the fork would then be merged onto the main project. And when that does happen, if you make a commit, let's say you do like a fork, you do your own commits. I think I even have an example of this on my own repos. If you do this, I'll kind of show you a little quickly. Let's see here. I think it's this one right here. No, it's not this.
Oh, yeah. Well, I remember you were showing the outlet before.
You get to get credit for contributing.
Yeah, because it gets added onto the main part. I think it's this one, Sebastian.
For Jessica, I mean, what I would do if I were you, I would just, if I didn't care about the history on all of those old labs, I would just kill the Git folder and do a new Git init. That gives me a whole new repository, and then go on GitHub and create new repositories for my new, for the project. And then whether you forked it or not, now it's your project.
Yeah, so exactly what Alvaro said, you can make a forked project into your own project one of two ways. One is what Alvaro just said, is you just, whatever on your local computer, you remove or rename the .git folder that's in that directory, and then you make it do a git init, and then create a repo on, like if I make a new repo, maybe I'll just set it real quick.
Will that erase all my history though?
No, so this is, oh yes, actually that does erase your history.
So then would it show that I only would it only show my past projects and then now going forward?
Yeah, so, okay, maybe I should slow down a little bit then. So there's two methods you could do. Maybe I'll write this down here because it'd be a little bit easier for us to, Git can sometimes get very like octopusy, like all these different like tentacles everywhere, and like they're tangled up and doing all these crazy things. So like if you wanted to have, like, let's say you had a GitHub repo.
Could I ask a favor? Can you expand your screen out some?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. Better? Yeah, there we go. Yeah, but then it's still small.
Is it still too small? Oh, so
well, I mean, I guess it's not too small, but it's just, yeah, cool. Thank you.
The only reason why I don't expand it all the way is that way I can see you guys' lovely faces and see your expressions when you guys get really confused.
Sure. That's cool too. No biggie either way.
No problem. All right, so let's say you have a GitHub. I have a GitHub repo that's a fork. Like, what do you do, right? So option number one, right? Option number one is kind of what Alvaro said. Well, actually, option number one is not do anything, right? But that's not what we want to do. So option number one is we can like delete / rename the .git folder in the repo, right? So I'll say the local. You guys know when I say local, right? And talking about like your own computer. Okay. Yeah. You'll hear that terminology a lot. Okay. So in the local repo, right? So you get rid of that. And the thing about that though, so some pros is that you can make contributions that will show up. Oops. I can miss my hand. There we go. That's why I like typing out live, like think and like talk at the same time. They'll appear on GitHub, right? So that's really good. Cons, all that history's gone.
Won't that look bad if all the history's gone?
Yeah, well, I don't know if bad's the right word, but it'll at least be like, oh, like you made like one commit for each of those repos, which is kind of like not really representative of what you did, right? You did multiple, but what likely happened, you did multiple commits and stuff like that. So this is kind of like the extreme version, and it works for some things if you do it really early on. If you like forked it and then deleted the Git repo, and then did that immediately, you're good, right? Problem with that is like if you've already made commits, it's like, oh, I already made a whole bunch of history like that, right? So there's another option that's really close to this, and I think it's a little more ideal. So what you can do is you have your Git folder, but you add a new remote, or I should say rewrite / add a new remote. So what this looks like, I can show you guys in a second, but what that basically means is like, instead of when you do like, for example, when you do a fork, right? And then do a git push, it's gonna do, it's gonna push to your forked repo, like the repo that is the fork, right? Some people, what happens is they'll go to another repository, and they'll like, for example, if you go to like, like my repository here, if you go to this repository and you do a clone, right? So you code, copy this and do a git clone, right? And then you do your own changes and you like say, oh, good, I'm just gonna go push this, and you do git add, git commit, and it'll show up perfectly fine, and you do a git push. It like yells at you, says, hey, you don't have permission to do that, right? So people will do this a lot of times with like the Learn, when you first start off, they'll do this with like the Learn curriculum. So the reason why is because it's saying that remote doesn't belong, it's not your repo, it's pushing it to, in this case, my repo right here, or the Learn curriculum repo, which you likely don't have permission to write to, right? Because like I restricted, so not everyone can just overwrite my stuff. So what you can do then is like, well, there's this thing called the remote. Oops, I'm over here. There's the remote part of your Git repo that says, where do you push this information to? Like, and that's what it means by remote. It's like when you do a git push, where's it going to? And that's where if you do like git push origin master or origin main now, the origin is basically that remote part. And that remote in this case is actually GitHub, or on GitHub. We can actually rewrite that and say, hey, don't push it to this repo. Instead, push it to this repo, which could be your own repo, which will keep all your commit history. You have access now to write in it, and it'll show your contributions, at least the ones that you've made on your contribution graph on GitHub. And also, you keep the whole history. So pros is you keep the history, contributions show up. Oops, on GitHub. Cons, a little more work, but not really that much, to be honest.
Yeah, I did this.
Yeah, that'd be worth it.
I did this at the beginning too, when I first started with doing the repos. Then I decided to change my remotes like that, just do the git remote. I think the git remote add and the git remote rename also.
Yeah, and that's exactly what you want. I think that's probably the easiest way. So I'm going to show you guys a little bit what that looks like. Does that sound?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So I made a little test directory here, which you can see this part right here. Let me just make sure I have it actually. CD test. Sorry, it's off screen right now, so I know you guys can't see this. Okay, good. It is a remote, or it is a Git repo. Right now, if I go to, let's say, a new terminal, just so you guys can see that. There we go. So ls, right? So you can see my test, and you can see, in this case, I have this little part right here that kind of shows a little bit how Git works, or like just showing me, oh, it's the master branch, right? So if I do Git, what's here? Yeah, let's say ls, you can see there's just a couple files in here. They don't really have anything there. But if you do Git status, you will see nothing's been on here yet. There's something I can add in here. If I do Git log, right? You can see doesn't have any commits yet. There's nothing on here. So it's like basically all I did here was I made a new thing, did Git init, and then I haven't done anything yet. So if I do actually, if you clone something, or you did like, do your fork and didn't Git clone, you will see, if you do Git remote -v, you'll see a list of your remotes on there, which would be origin, whatever. But we don't have that here. So what you can do here, I'll kind of show you a little bit when you make a new repo. I'm just going to call it the same thing, just make it not confusing. So making a repo. So you make a new, so this process, like, okay, let's say we want to keep our contributions. What do we do? So what we can do is say, okay, make a new repo, call it whatever you want, right? You can do this on GitHub itself. And then you get this page right here because there's no commits and everything like this. So you notice that usually you probably will do this, like, oh, you do all this part, basically telling you make your first commit, then doing the Git remote add origin, and then Git push, and then you have whatever you had, your new repo will be synced up with this one. There's another one where we have an existing repo. And if we have an existing repo, we can actually add this origin right here, like this, okay? And we can actually say, okay, let me copy this, git remote add origin in this case. This is my repo that I have. This already exists. I can add this on here, and that then will add my remote onto this part. So let me show you what that looks like. So now if I have this part, you can git remote -v. You can see now my origin, and then it's actually pointing to my repo right here, which now is like, hey, like now that this guy right here, in this case I put origin. When I do a git push, you know, origin, you know, in this case it's master, but git push origin, then whatever your branch is, that will then say, okay, it's going to push to that specific repo right here. So what you can do, let's see if I can quickly just find a random repo on here. Let's see here.
And you can actually keep multiple repos if you wanted to push to different places.
Yeah, you really can.
They don't hold you back from you know, having different remotes that you can you know, you can push to. So maybe you got your backup remote. I don't know.
Yeah, so there's actually things, we'll kind of maybe talk about this thing called Heroku. I don't know if anyone's come across this. So this is not going to work, but just kind of show you, like, you could do, like, you know, this is a new remote. So if I do git remote -v, you can have a different remote now. So instead of doing git push origin, origin master, I can do, in this case I called it on just because I was lazy, on, and I can push this specific branch that I have right here, right? And the on is my new remote. So you can actually have multiple remotes. For the Heroku, for example, you can actually push your repo to Heroku, and Heroku will actually, it's basically allows you to make a little web app. And so you can actually have that run in over there, and that's a new place to put it. If you had like GitLab, you know, which is like GitHub, but like a different version of Git, using Git, right? You can have it pushed there, you can have it the Bitbucket, you can do all these different places. You can even have this point to another computer on your network, or another folder on your network, or like on your computer. So this is really useful when you have something like you are working with on a business, right? And you have your own repo, and you have like the central like place where everyone puts their work or whatever. Maybe they do tests and stuff like that. You can push it onto that part right there, and that's where everyone's repo lives as the final version. So you can really think of this git push as beyond just GitHub itself. It's really about saying, oh, it's pushing it into another place, you know, wherever that place is. And usually that means the web, but it could also be like a different folder, stuff like that. So that kind of,
yeah, you can kind of use it for software distribution as well.
That's right. That's right. So that's a question.
Yeah, I have a question. So, okay, so since on my local computer, you know, the lab's all done, and then if I make a new repo and push it up to that, is it just automatically going to account for all my code?
So yeah, let's check this out a little bit. So see what this kind of looks like. So let's say I do a git clone. Let's say we do a fork. I'll copy what you guys do probably. I do a fork, and I'm going to fork it from my guy right here.
This is really helpful too. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem. Actually, I was going to ask you guys, I'm kind of getting close to the end, but we'll go a little bit over. Would you guys like, I was thinking about doing one that's more like broad for like not just our cohort, but like other cohorts too, just kind of for everyone. If we went over some like just GitHub stuff, like maybe like relevant to get data science stuff. Would you guys like to see something like that, like maybe next week?
Yeah. Sure. Is this one only going to 2 today?
It's supposed to only go for, yeah, we would start at 1. We start 1 at Pacific time. 1 Pacific time on Tuesday.
I thought you guys started. Oh, I thought it started at 1:30. Darn. Sorry.
That's okay. We have it recording right now too. So
okay, good.
If you didn't miss it.
Good.
Yeah.
But yeah, my question, I had exactly Jessica's question, and also the thing about like, you know how, I mean, there's so many labs where it just like, frankly, it just wasn't clear. And especially having been in a full-time cohort, it was like, there's no way we're going to go through and like try to figure out all this stuff from scratch, especially in earlier curriculum versions when they sometimes didn't do a great job of explaining things. So yeah, Jessica's question, I also had that one around. I think maybe it's implied in what, Jessica, you're asking, but it's like, what do we do when, you know, sometimes I might just make a note, this is from the solution set or whatever, but that may not be necessary, except that, you know, if it's verbatim because I was just doing it as a code along, then do I put it up there or not?
Right. And I think it is, to be To be fair, like, yeah, I do think it's maybe a little confusing for you guys because I think there's a lot we can do with Git, and I think it's a little tough. How do I say this? I'm kind of going both ways. Like, one's like, oh, I'm kind of defending curriculum because obviously, working here too, right? But like, defending like what that system looks like, but also like realizing like what you guys have had as pain points of like trying to make that work. And I think there's a little bit of there's definitely a disconnect between those two like ways of not approaching it, but like different people have different like focuses. And for the curriculum itself, it's kind of like, oh, we want to be able to get you get started without having to go through all of Git going forward. But then from your guys' perspective too, it's like you guys in a sense need to know a little bit about Git in order to like take advantage of that.
Right. But I mean, I'm talking about the content also of what we push out there.
You're saying like what you want to share? Like,
yeah, I mean, if we basically, if I'm working on a lab and it's like, they're trying to do too much, which I think especially earlier on, they, either they were just kind of punting at it or they would, they thought we were going to go out there and go and look up, all these different things and like there was not enough time, especially in a full-time program. There just wasn't enough time to do that. And so a lot of times I would end up just going to and I mean, a lot of people did this. I know that.
You're saying like when there's the lab and the solution, like going to the solution.
Just going through the solution set because it's like, okay, I got to get through this thing. And, or else I'm never going to, never going to get to a point even within a mod. Yeah. So I don't know, Jessica, if that's what you were asking, but I really, that's something that it's not
ethically, like if you use the solutions, is it fair to have that look beyond your contributions?
I think I get what you're saying. Like if you have the solution that like the solution branch, right, and say, oh, here it is. I would say like, how do I say this? What code you run and what code you fill is like your work. Even if you took, let's say you cloned the solution branch and you went through that and ran it and you didn't really change much on there, like I don't think there's a real big problem with like saying, oh, you've done this work because you did run that code, maybe you explored it a little bit, like, and you want to save that onto GitHub. That's usually how people look at GitHub. They're not looking at it essentially as like, oh, is this like what's it like did you pass this test? It's much more like, oh, it's like a place to put your code in. And if I would say is that if your GitHub reflects what you've been doing in the sense that like you ran this code, you looked at this code, you took effort in there and you're putting it in a place for you to see, right? Like, I think that's perfectly fine to have that as a contribution. And people will see that too, think, oh, this is more of a lesson than it is like a full project that you're sharing. I will say like, you still want to be careful in the sense like, and this is just in general, like also ethically, right? Is you don't want to try to claim something as being like, oh, look what I did. In reality, it's like, that's not what you did. You just took someone else's work and like, did that part. And that's one of the reasons why is like, if you do remove like the .git, history, at least put some reference to like where this originally come from. So that way it's easy for someone to say, oh, like this is where it originated from. But it's just, this is their own work or like a variation of their work. But I don't think it's a problem having it on there. Kind of speaking a little bit to what Gino was saying, like with the solution stuff. Yeah, I totally feel you. Like this is more the meta of talking about not GitHub, but more like about the actual curriculum, stuff like that. Yeah, I do think there's a little bit of, I try to tell you guys early on, I don't know if you guys remember this either for people who are in my cohort, is that I try to say like, when you're doing the lessons and like you're doing those labs and solutions, like I don't even like saying the solution as a solution. I like to say the solution is like an example, like work through. Because even the solutions don't always have the best ways of doing it. And like, sometimes we'll even do things like you said, Gina, like it was like, oh, had something that you had to look up to like know how to do. And it's like, you're supposed to have that time. And yeah, I would say like, I like to think of like the labs as more of a practice, but not a necessary need to complete practice. Like I used to do this, like I was just I had a conversation about this when I was in math back in high school. Like I had a teacher that would give like a bunch of problems on math and like I would have to like, there's like 40 problems, every other day, which, she was a really tough teacher. She was a really great teacher too. But I didn't like homework. I still don't like homework. I think homework has a lot of negatives to it, but I wouldn't do all the homework. But what I would do is I would take, if you remember how math usually structured in like school, they usually have like, here's like a specific topic and then like 5 or 10 problems, you know, on that specific like topic, like, you know, I don't know, solving equations. And then they'd have like the next set of 10 problems, like, oh, on this subtopic in the math thing. I would do like, you know, I wouldn't do all my homework, which, you know, sounds kind of bad, but like, I would just like, oh, like, let me look at these problems and say, okay, which ones are kind of just randomly pick them, or pick one that I think would be a little difficult, or make sure I knew how to do it and run through that problem. Like, oh, I understand how to do that. And I wouldn't do the rest of them and then move on to the next part. That's kind of, in my mind, kind of how I view the labs, as being like, you don't need to like completely go through it, understand every single aspect of it before you can say, yes, I know this. Like, I think of it as like, oh, use this to kind of practice, check your knowledge, and like, okay, can I do this? You know, like there's some parts that are going to be a little more work, perfectly fine to look at the solution, maybe even use the exact solution they have on there and work through that and say, okay, does this make sense? And you're not going, like, even if someone who takes a week to do that one lab, they're not going to be an expert in that one, you know, doing everything in that lab. It's going to take time, right? And I think that's kind of like, it's my philosophy, and what I try to tell you guys is like, use the labs to practice and check your knowledge and find the pain points of like, what do I understand? And if it's taking a long time and you're like, but it's not something I really need to work on, it's like, okay, like it's a good thing to know, but don't like stress out being like, oh no, it took me like an hour to figure this out. You know, it's like, oh, but it was like reading in a file. And it's like, oh, that was a very specific thing. Like I need to look at reading in files, but it doesn't tell you about the whole as like, you know, developing an support vector machine or whatever it is the lab is talking about. Yeah, that's a little more meta than like talking about the GitHub stuff, but I think if you practice that too, especially if you look other resources like after graduating, that's a good way to kind of practice. Be like, you don't need to like hammer through and like, you know, I like to tell people it's like because I was a bad student, didn't do homework. I knew how to study for tests really well, like effectively. So I understood how to generalize my work really well versus powering through doing the homework. And I don't know if this kind of helps a little bit. I don't know if this tells a little bit about like who I am, but like instead of powering through the homework and like finishing done, it's like cool. Like a lot of people would like do all that work, you know, a lot of my peers, they do all their work, they get the end of their homework, like, cool, I'm ready for the tests. And like, and you guys probably know this too, like, you know, I was a high school student, you know, we're high school students, we don't really think in those terms, but I kind of realized like, I don't need to finish the homework. Like, I just need to know enough, like not know enough, but I need to make sure I practice the points that I really don't understand so I can do the test, which was in my view, like, oh, that's where all the points are. So like, why even like bother with the homework in my viewpoint? And I think that helps in general in real life. Is like, just because you go through something once, like it's like reading a book. It's like, just because you read the book once, you know, a textbook or whatever, doesn't mean you know it now. It just means that you finished the book. And you probably, like I do this all the time. I go back in my technical books, reread parts of it, revisit it. I realize certain parts like, oh, I kind of get like quickly skimmed over this part, but it turns out this is a really important part. And I now know more knowledge I can add on to it. So I don't know, that's kind of like my advice for meta learning. like how do you learn? And I think the big part is like, it's the revisiting part. And I don't know, I know this is kind of like late in the game, like you guys are all like on capstone now. So it's like, oh, like things that you should consider. But at least going forward, I think that helps. At least I hope
and
it
it's
helps.
It's not too late in the game as far as what we do with our repos and stuff like that. Because I kind of stopped committing stuff because I'm like, I don't know if, you know, I should be committing this stuff if I'm basically using the lab as a code along or what. So yeah, I mean, who knows if I'll have time, but you know, it's like, I'd like to know what's sort of like acceptable, appropriate, at least from Flatirons.
Yeah, I would say don't try to recreate, like if you like haven't been doing commits on like your past labs, don't go back to mod 2 just to make commits just so you can have commits on that lab. Like just say like, okay, that's just what it is, like move on. But if there is something like, you know, like I think close to what Jessica's saying, if she did do commits, but she kind of wants at least some of those projects or some of those labs to kind of show up on her GitHub, this is kind of like the strategy you would take, right? So that's what I'm about to show you guys right now. So let me kind of take a second. Yeah, go ahead, Jessica.
Thanks for sharing. So as you're going into that, so could a third option be that I just go through and like push all my labs up to the forked repos that already exist? So then if someone in the future is like looking on my GitHub and they're like, oh, all these repos, and then they click on them, they can at least see like what I've learned and done.
Yeah, I think at the very least, like if you use your GitHub as kind of evidence of like, oh, you've been doing stuff, that's kind of what I picture for your guys' stage right now, what your GitHub repos really represent is like, you've been doing stuff for the past, you know, almost a year, you know, give or take. I think that's a good place to have it. And then, you know, as you guys have like, you know, more work on, let's say, you know, oops, that's the wrong one. If you have more work on, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
And then I just pin all my projects, and then I just have.
Yeah, you have it up here. You can even, like I kind of mentioned a little bit, like there's this repo you can have and have a README. You can even maybe put your projects here, summary of your Flatiron stuff in this spot. And that could be really useful too, because like, oh good, like I have this information plus the pin stuff. So the main thing is like, you want to see like when someone goes to your profile, because you put it on your resume, what are they going to see first, and make sure they can kind of like see the things that you care about, what you want them to see first, right? This you have less control over, right? But like at least these things up here, you have a lot more control.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Cool.
Thanks.
Cool. I know we're kind of at time, but do you guys want me to kind of finish up sharing this guy?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay. All right, cool. I'll get back into this part then, and then we'll probably end it there. So let me close this guy. Okay, so I forked this repo. Good recap, right? I feel like it's been a while. I took this repo, I took a random one from Git apparently, and I forked it, right? So now I have my own fork, and that's why you see this part right here. Now I can push onto this part right here, right? If I went to, just to review like what you don't want to do, if I went to this repo here and cloned it, right? If I clone this and then try to do a git add, git commit, git push, it'll give me an error. Do you guys want to see that, or do you guys know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I'd love to see it.
Okay, I'll show you guys. So let's say I go to this repo here. I didn't fork it yet. I go here, I copy this URL. I go to my terminal. I'm going to go up one level. So we have that. I'm going to rename it real quick just so we don't get any conflicts. It won't change anything, so you can see it this way. So now I'm like, okay, let me do a git clone. And remember, we're doing not my repo, but the original repo right here. And it's going to take a second for it to clone. But then once I clone it, I'm going to cd into it. Oops, what's it called? .scm. Okay, so I have this repo here. If I do git log, oops. You guys see like, here's the commits. These are not me, right? And in fact, if I do like git lg, this is a little quick thing for me. Git lg is not going to work for you. It's a little bit easier for C, but you can see like how the different commits and different stuff. And this is all not me, right? So if I do now, let's say I just do touch just makes a file, like a new file. And then I do git status, right? You'll see a new file has not been added. So I do git add new file. You can see now it's ready, right? So you guys, typical Git flow, right? Git commit, I'm just doing message, hi. Okay, bad git commit message, but it works, right? Git status, cool, nothing's there. If I do git log now, you will see my guy right here, cool. Okay, now if I do a git push, right? Like, okay, cool, I made my commit, I want to git push, I get git push. Oh, you can also see, just real quick, git remote.v or -v. You can see that's where I'm going to push the origin to, right? So if I do, oops, didn't mean to click it. If I do git push, it'll push that origin automatically. If I want to be specific, I do origin master, right? Same thing. If I do this now, you get permission error, right? Say, hey, you're not denied that, and that's because I don't have permission to write to this repo here. Like this is not my repo. I don't have the permission right to like add code here, and that's typically what people will have, right? And so what you should have done, right, ideally, is you could take this guy right here and what we talked about in the curriculum is like we do a fork, right? So we fork this, and that's just what I think most people did, right? If you kind of follow along with the curriculum. You fork this guy. So we already did that. We forked it. I'm going to go into git, what's it called? Mine. Okay, so this is my repo now. And if I do git remote, you'll see the difference here. This one's my repo right here, Mr. Geislinger, right? Versus like this one right here was, you know, the user was Git, right? So it's, oops, keep clicking by accident. But you can see there's the difference right there already. So like, okay, cool. So then we can say, okay, let me go ahead and do, if I had this fork right here, it's like, oh, I would have to then, if I do git push, right? Let's say do git add. Oh, I gotta make a new file. Touch new dot text, git status, git add, oops, and then git commit dash m hi, right? Oops. Okay, and then we get status, cool, and then git log. You can see there's my new commit. Okay, so cool. That's much better than what we had before. But then this is the problem we had with git push, right? Well, now git push will actually add to my repo, my forked repo, right? But just to kind of emphasize a little bit like how contributions are added, you can see I'm going to refresh this real quick just to show you guys. Is that as of right now, I have 2 contributions for today, October 6, 2020. And you can see basically I made a new repo called test, and I made a new forked repo here, right? You guys see that? And that's where my 2 contributions come from. Okay, so the thing is though now, if I do a git push now, which I have a commit in there, right? And it's pushing, take a second, it's pushed, right? So now if I go to my forked repo, which is this guy right here, we'll see 1,892 commits. Boom, right? There's my little commit, right? So the thing is though, is that this is only on my fork repo. So if I go back to my contributions, which normally would show, you know, how many contributions I have, like which include commits. If I refresh this, you'll see that there's only still 2 commit or contributions. And you're like, oh, like if you made like 10 contributions, right? Contributions, commits and stuff like this, they won't show up in your forked repos. So you're like, oh, dang, like that's not what I want, right? Like that's kind of lame. Like I want to show like a little bit that I've been doing work, right? At least make it really clear. So what you can do instead is you can add a new remote. So if I remember, git remote -v, oops, is going to a forked repo, right? This is a fork repo. What if instead I made a new repo? So I made a new repo and it was called test, right? Remember, there's nothing on here. I can actually add this guy right here onto my current repo. And I actually think this won't work, but I think because I already have an origin, but let's just say we do this right now. So I have a new repo, I make a new repo that's where my actual work's gonna be. It's not a fork anymore. It's my own special repo that's separate from the other thing, but I still want the history. I can do, I think this is gonna give me an error, let's see. I can add the remote onto here. Yeah, so it already exists. So I could, for example, change git remote add and then change it to a different name. I could do that. I think, I'm trying to remember how to delete a remote. So if you don't know, git remote -h.
Git remote remove.
Remote remove. See, I always forget it. I always think it's like a -d. So git remote, and there it is right here. You guys see that? When I do help. -h means help, right? So git remote remove, and then I have to give the name. In this case, it's called origin, right? As we saw, where is it? Right here. So remove, and then if I do git remote -v, which is going to basically list out there, there's nothing there. So now I can go ahead and do git remote add my personal repo, not the fork. Does that make sense to everyone so far? Any questions? I just want to make sure before I move on to this part.
Just quickly, is there a way to tell whether something is a fork or not?
Yeah, not on Git. Yeah, because forks are specific to GitHub, not Git itself. So that's why Git doesn't know what this is. Git just says, hey, it's some place to put the repo, like, and it just takes it. But GitHub, that's what the contributions are specific to GitHub, right? And note that even though I removed this remote, you'll see that if I refresh this still exists. Like, it's still there. Nothing's changed, right? Because I haven't done anything. I just did it on my own local computer. But now what we want to do, we want to add it to that special new repo that I made called test. And I do git remote add origin, that test, right? Which if you remember, it's just simply this. You don't have to like actually remember this. Like you don't have to make a new repo and then like copy this. You could actually do this yourself if you already made a repo. It's probably the easiest way to do this. But I have this part. I'm going to do git add origin. That's the name of the remote. And then the link to this guy, which is essentially this repo. So if I do this now, you see I got a remote. I do git remote -v, right? And you can see I have now a remote that I can push to. So now if I do git remote, oops, git remote push, I think I just do, well, okay, let's just do git, I'm sorry, git push, right? So we're pushing now to this origin automatically. I think I might have to do a setup, but let's see what happens. Yeah. So git push -u origin master. The reason why we do this first is because we're making sure the repo that sits on GitHub, it has to know what branch specifically are we pushing up and setting it up. That's where the set upstream is. You can just do a -u, which you could have done -- set upstream or -u. It does the same thing. Alvaro, did you have a question or a comment?
Yeah, I was just going to say that when you do the git remote add, you could just change the name. Instead of using origin, you could have used any name. It doesn't care because that's just an alias, right?
That's right.
The only thing that matters is the URL.
That's right. This origin is just kind of like what people typically use, but you're absolutely right. We could have added it whatever you want like we did earlier. In fact, if I really wanted to, let's say we got this guy right here. I could have added, maybe we'll do this in a second, but we can actually add that forked repo as a separate, instead of origin or whatever, we can name it like, fork, and for example, and we can do a git push on the fork. So that'd be one option.
Yeah, you can also at any time rename, rename it. So it'll still take you to the same place, it'll just have a different name.
That's right. I do this just because it's users like, I don't want to push anyone to that fork anymore. So I'm just going to delete that reference and make a new reference, which is the default origin. Okay. Yeah, good point. Good to point that out. So in this case, I'm going to git push -u origin master, which origin right now sits at this repo that I created. If I do this now, remember we just made one commit, right? But we have to push the whole history, right? What's nice about this is that we now have the full history of that repo before we forked it, right? Plus that new commit that we just had, which is like, I just made a new file. And it takes a second because it's uploading this whole bunch. I probably picked the bad repo where it's pretty decently sized, so it takes a second. But it's pushing that up right now, and then eventually what happens when this is all pushed, we'll see this refreshed here. We'll actually see the commits. I don't think it'll show up yet. It's got to finish first. So once this is done, there we go. Resolving, tell me it's complete. It shouldn't error out, but I'm just kind of, there it goes. All right, so now if I refresh this, you'll see that it'll have 1,892 commits. That extra commit is the 1,892nd commit is my new text file. In fact, you can probably see it. What is it? New text. There it is. Hi, right? And you can see it's got the full history here. And this is my repo now. It's not a forked repo anymore. But what's nice is that people can actually find this with its full commit history on here, right? They can see this. This is where you might want to add in here, like under like description or something like this, is you might add that original repo. So if someone could find it, then some people know what's going on. That's just a nice thing to do, but it's definitely not necessary. It's good to note that if you do something like this, you might want to say, hey, this is where the original came from, and this is what I'm doing with this, just to make it clear that it's like, oh, if you had some like change in work, whatever. People will do this like if they make a new fork. Now, the main thing about this is nice. It's like, okay, cool. It's no longer a fork, so it's like no longer looking like, you just are making a copy of this thing that's going to be merged in later, which is usually not what you're trying to do for the Learn curriculum. And you have now your own commit on here, which is good. You have the full history of all the commits. So if there's something that someone else had changed, you could always go back on that. And the other thing that we have, remember this has only had 2 contributions because contributions to the fork don't count. So if I refresh this now, we should see a third contribution. And there it is, third contribution. And it's because we have a new commit on this repository, which I called test, right? And with all this parts. So that's essentially how you can get like, and what's nice is that if you already made those contributions, like those commits on a fork repo, all you gotta do essentially is change that remote or add a remote, like Alvaro said, like with a new name, or replace that, remote with something else and push that to a new repo that you create. And then you have all that history on there, including what other people have done in what you've done in the past. And what's nice is that will actually backlog. So if you actually made, let's say you made this repo, this fork repo back in June, right? And you do that thing where you say add a new remote. So you remove the old origin, add a new origin, right? And do a git push. The contribution will actually show up in June, not for today, because it keeps a history of when you made that commit.
That's interesting. So that's really helpful. I think that's the thing, maybe the thing I was hoping to accomplish, so that it shows when I did it, but that I did it. And so that's really cool. It isn't just the day you created that new repository and then all the contributions show up on that day, but rather when they actually were done. And then a quick question. So you said like, right, you want to make a note if the thing originally came from somewhere else, like literally on this page here where you are right now. Is this where you would make that note, or how would you go about doing that? Or is it in the README or what?
Yeah, so you can probably do it in a couple places. I like to put it in the description here because it's specific on Git, GitHub. So I say put it here. So for example, I'll show you a repo that I have recently done. I was doing this little project, but this project was based off of this repo here. So I just put cloning behavior for an automated system, initial start from Udacity repos. This is from Udacity. And this is like freely available for everyone to kind of like check out, right, and do stuff. So I said, oh, this is the repo here. So that way someone comes to my thing, they'll see this first and they'll say, oh, that's where it came from. I even put it in my README here. It's like, oh, this is a project for Udacity. That's where, you know, this comes from. So that at least people can kind of like navigate towards there and like be like, oh, like, is this something like, for example, I'm doing like a couple of these things. I didn't do this myself. This was from that original repo. And if you look at my commit history, you should see, I have a lot of commits on this guy. We should see commits from other people. So for example, in this case, this is just one commit from that original repo. And that way we can see like, oh, that's where this came from, and you keep that history. In this case, for the record, this is more advanced Git stuff. I actually squashed all those commits into one commit. So the original repo actually has like 30 commits. I just squashed it all into one commit and stuff like that. It's not necessary, but it kept my repo cleaner to what I expected it. And that's because I'm doing this repo, like I'm being a little more organized on this because in case other people want to use this, they don't have to have a huge backlog of other commits that aren't really necessary for them. But know that for the record, like if you do it the way we just showed, you would have all the backlog of commits plus whatever commits you make on top of it.
Cool. Thank you. That's great.
Yeah, no problem.
A question too.
Yeah.
So for my projects, I would always do commits and then I do like the getting order for the checkpoints. But when it came to labs, I wouldn't do commits. I would just save at checkpoints. Is that still gonna like show up as commits?
Yeah, so it won't show up as a commit if you just like you're saying like in Jupyter Notebook you do like gets or just save, right?
Yeah,
like,
I would just save. I never like committed anything.
Yeah, you just like file save or like whatever's up here, right?
Yeah. So is it more about the commit or is it about the amount of code? Like so if I were to like commit kind of everything, and then put that up, is it gonna count as like more than one commit? Does that make sense?
Yeah,
like how it logs commits?
Yeah,
I don't know.
Your commit is kind of like a super save. Like when you save a file, it saves that specific file. Like, you know, you guys know how computers work. Like, oh yeah, we just do a save, like the file is saved, your checkpoint, right? But a git commit is like saving a spot in history. So it's like, oh, at this point in history, this is what the repo looked like.
Yeah, but for some reason, or yeah, maybe Alvaro's gonna speak to this.
No, I was just gonna say, so the commit history that's in your Git folder locally, that commit history syncs up with the history up on the GitHub server, correct? And so all of your commits, if you did all your commits locally without ever pushing, and then you decide one day, oh, you know what, I never pushed anything, let me push it today. All of that is going to sync up, and all of those commits are going to show up. All those commits that you made locally but never pushed are all going to show up because now it's all going to sync with the remote repo.
That's right, and I think you're just kind of commenting on that right now. There, less of a question, right?
So okay, so because I think isn't it like if I just made a small change and committed it. Don't not all commits count toward the contribution? Isn't it only if it's like a certain amount of like change or code, or no?
Nope, as long as there's some, yeah, when you do a git commit, when you commit something, there has to be some change. Like that's what that change means. Like when you do a git commit, right? Like for example, if I do git status right here, there's no changes. So if I do git commit, it's gonna be like, there's nothing to commit. Like if I do a git add dot and do a git commit, again, nothing's changed. It's like, there's nothing to change. Like there's nothing to commit. So as long as there is a change, and that change could literally be a new file, it could be a period in the middle of the thing. Not that I'm saying like you guys should do commits of like every little tiny little like word you type out, right? But whatever that change is, all Git says, all right, whatever you made the change for, I'm going to save that point in time and say you made this commit at this point, and that's what the repo looked at that point, and I'm going to commit that as like a time, like if you think of Git as more like saving your timeline, it's like that's the point in time, and that's why you'll see people like, for example, like you'll see kind of like this kind of structure of like this branching, and the idea is that each point is like a separate point in time where you made a specific change, and the change could be like literally a dot on the file. It could be huge changes across all the files. It could be like everything. Git doesn't really care. Git just says, oh, that's just what that looks like at that point in time.
Yeah.
Does that make sense, Jessica?
And, yeah. And I've always gotten that, like intuitively how it works, you know, with like, it's like time stamping all the versions and like all the changes. But yeah, I don't know, for some reason, I just remember I was like reading what counts in contributions, and for some reason I thought like, I mean, it's been a little while since I looked at it, but for some reason I thought like not all my commits showed up as contributions.
Right. And some don't commits, some commits don't count as contributions. The only contributions that count for commit wise are ones that are done on repos that are not forks on the default branch in GitHub. So for example, like I have this guy here, I have like 4 different branches. If I make commits on these different branches, because main is my default branch, those commits on here, for example, I think I have one on modeling. Nope, maybe it's on current work. Okay, good. See, it's one commit ahead of main. You can see, for example, that was done on, I don't know, whenever I did that. But like this, because this is not my main branch current work, and I made a commit onto this branch. I know we haven't really talked about branches too much, but that won't count on my contribution graph until it gets merged onto my default main branch. And then it goes one step above that. It's like, okay, it has to be on your main branch, or not main branch, but your default branch. And it has to be in GitHub. This is all GitHub stuff, right? It has to be a non-forked repo.
Okay, so then for my case specifically, the best thing to do would probably just be to go through and push everything up so that at least it's like shows the work I've worked on. But for my case, not necessarily, because I didn't do all the commits along the way, not necessarily like doing what we just walked through. But then for somebody like Gina who did do the commits, like something like this would show up in her commit history.
Right, yeah. If you've been doing commits along the way, you might reason like, oh yeah, it might be worth me doing that Git push. To be honest, I wouldn't stress out too much about this guy right here. Yeah. If you do have the opportunity to kind of show at least, like I would say, like if you show a little bit like what you've kind of done. So maybe if there's a few main labs that you've really done a lot of work on and you want to show that you did a lot of work, those works, then push those up. But you guys probably have like
it's along the way.
Yeah, you guys, if you guys have like 300, 500 repos, don't do that for 500 repos.
repos. Yeah.
Yeah, don't do that for every repo. In fact, usually at this point in time, people like when you guys are close to graduating, people go like, so I have 500 repos, like what should I do about that? It's like, well, you got a couple options. One, you could delete all of it, you know, like by going individually deleting each repo, which is like, there's really not much of a better option, unfortunately. Like on how to delete it, you have to like literally delete each repo, or you can just keep them there and just say, all right, I got 500 repos plus whatever I do in the future. Like that could be what it is. I've been on GitHub, right, 2014 it looks like, and I have like almost 100 repos or whatever. Like it is like, I'm like, whatever, like I don't go back to them and stuff like this. Oh, I should note though, if you do want to keep a little bit of your contribution stuff. So for example, this happened to me because I was like, oh, you can notice like, oh, there's not that many contributions on here. Like mostly are just like making repos. But I have done commits on here. Like, oh, like that's weird. Like what's on here? It's because I changed my repo, my GitHub name. And so I used to use like Victor Lauren on here, and I said, oh, I'm just gonna keep it because I have all these other ones, Mr. Geislinger. It was easier for me. If you change your name, the commits will still exist on here and all that stuff, but they won't necessarily show on your contribution graph, which again, not a big deal. Like, you know, is this going to get you higher depending on how much stuff's on here? Not really, right? Like, it's just like another first impression, right? But if you have the other stuff on here, that's going to stand out more. But something to note is that if you do change your name, your contributions won't show up like they typically have been. So if you do have your GitHub guy right here, it's good to have something that's relatively professional. Don't have like a bunch of curse words or something, you know, like random numbers and letters and stuff like that. It's probably not a good idea, because if you're sharing out your GitHub repo, people kind of want to see at least some level of professionalism for the most part. So if you do have something like that, I would change your name. But like if you have something that's like, that's like professional enough, you're probably fine. And I wouldn't stress out about it. But just know if you do change it, you can make it look like you haven't done anything since the beginning of time or whatever. So yeah, hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, but from this point on, I would say is that if you guys do work, especially for your projects or anything else beyond like Flatiron, like try to make it so like you do have your contributions like show up on here, because it does show that you've done work. And it's not the only thing that's going to like, it's not like the factor that's going to keep you, but it is a nice extra thing saying, oh, look, this person's been doing work for a while and they've been making contributions onto GitHub, meaning that, you know, it's not the best proxy for saying how much work has people done, but it's a direct like consequence of someone doing work, right? So recruiters do like to kind of see that a little bit. And so if your things does look kind of plain, like maybe think about like when you're doing extra work, use it, you know, like don't worry too much about like your repository being public, like unless you have something sensitive or whatever, right? But like don't worry about like oh, my code's no good or whatever. It's fine. Like people don't think of GitHub in that way of being like, oh, it's all professional work. You'll see very professional people have very like random stuff on their GitHub and stuff like that, and it's perfectly fine to have that. But it's another factor, right? So that's what you should really think of it like. Yeah, cool. Well, that's kind of it. I know we're way past time, but hopefully you guys find that useful too. And I know we didn't really talk about the big files and stuff like that, but maybe we'll talk about that next time. Or I think I mentioned, if you guys are interested, maybe I'll open up, maybe we'll do like a longer session for Git stuff. And I'll make sure to structure it that way we like have a little bit of timing. So like if there is a little bit like, oh, we make sure we get through these parts. I'll do that for like maybe next week, and maybe I'll open it up to the kind of like announce it to other cohorts too. So if they want to come in, because I'm sure like Gina, you know, you weren't part of our cohort, right? Like I'm sure you had lots of questions going forward, like from the very beginning, and like you're like, oh, wish I know this ahead of time. Totally feel that. But I will point you guys, I know my cohort, like you guys been here at the beginning, so you guys probably already seen this, but might be useful. In the resources, I have Git here. I kind of go through a couple, like for example, I have this little video to talk about like exactly what kind of Alvaro was saying, like, oh, you can like remove this stuff. I think I showed you guys early on. So this could be useful. It's under the Git part, Git directory, and then tools. And I show a little bit like what that looks like, right? So you can see a little bit of like doing that. Anyway, that could be useful. I don't actually, it's been a long time since I've done this, so I don't even know how nice this looks. I don't know if has anyone used this Git clone shell back when I showed it?
I have used it before. Okay. Even though I didn't like continue on, I did do it, yeah.
Okay, so it worked at least at some point. I'm pretty sure it should still work now. But yeah, so that can be useful. I think I might update this later on too. But I think this is probably the best, like the easiest way to do this without the least amount of work. So yeah. Cool. All right, everyone. Well, I'll end it here. Next time we'll see, we can talk about model iteration. So we'll kind of talk a little bit about that. And then I guess I'll hold off a little bit of like talking about large files on Git and just using Git for data science stuff. We'll do that maybe next week. It'll probably be about this time. I'll just kind of see what works out. Maybe we'll make it an hour and a half long versus like an hour long. It's because there's so much we could do. We won't go over everything on Git, but I think we can at least go through a few topics and stuff like that. That you guys hopefully will find useful too. And at least the stuff that I find useful when I'm doing like a lot of work on Git and GitHub. Okay. Everyone.
Yeah,
well,
sounds good.
Yeah. All right. Well, everyone have a great evening. And I hope to see you guys maybe Thursday, maybe sooner. So take care, everyone.
Take care.